The sun hung low over a quiet suburban park, its golden rays casting long shadows across the pavement. Families strolled lazily, kids laughed as they chased each other around the swings, and the distant hum of a nearby road blended into the peaceful ambience. It was one of those afternoons that felt like nothing could possibly go wrong. But for one elderly woman, sitting alone on a worn bench with her knitting needles softly clinking together, the tranquility was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. She was frail, her silver hair tied back into a neat bun, her face lined with years of life stories. Her hands moved with a rhythm born of decades of practice, and every so often, she'd look up with a faint smile as children ran past her, their energy a stark contrast to her calm demeanor. It was hard to imagine anyone looking at her and seeing anything but warmth and kindness. Yet, not far away, trouble was brewing. The low guttural rumble of a motorcycle broke the serene atmosphere as it pulled into view. A man wearing a black leather jacket, his arms adorned with tattoos and his helmet slung under one arm, dismounted and scanned the area. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the world owed him something. His name wasn't important, at least not to those who knew better than to get in his way. He was the kind of person who enjoyed commanding attention, and his sharp, piercing gaze suggested that confrontation was a language he spoke fluently. The biker's eyes locked onto the elderly woman. For reasons known only to him, her quiet presence seemed to ignite something ugly within him. He strode toward her, his boots thudding heavily against the concrete, the sound carrying an unspoken threat. "Hey," he barked, loud enough for several heads to turn. The elderly woman looked up, startled, her knitting pausing mid-stitch. She offered a hesitant smile, unsure if he was addressing her or someone behind her. But there was no mistaking it. His sneer and the dismissive wave of his hand left no doubt. "What do you think you're doing here?" he demanded, his voice laced with contempt. "This ain't your spot." The woman's brows knit together in confusion. "I'm sorry," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I said, you don't belong here." The biker snarled, stepping closer. His words hung in the air like a dark cloud, their weight pressing down on the small crowd that had started to gather at a safe distance. People exchanged nervous glances but stayed rooted in place, unsure whether to intervene or simply walk away. And that's when the camera panned ever so subtly to a man standing a few feet away, leaning casually against a tree. His arms were crossed, and a baseball cap shaded his face, but the unmistakable figure of John Cena wasn't hard to recognize for those who looked closely. Clad in a simple t-shirt and jeans, Cena watched the unfolding scene intently, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. He hadn't moved a muscle, yet. But something in his stance suggested that the quiet, easygoing demeanor could shift in an instant. The tension was palpable as the biker continued his tirade, oblivious to the silent storm brewing just a stone's throw away. Cena's eyes never left the scene, and though he hadn't said a word, his presence was impossible to ignore. What would happen next was anyone's guess, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to end the way the biker expected. "Would you like me to expand further or tweak anything about this opening?" The biker loomed over the elderly woman, his voice growing louder and sharper with each passing second. His words didn't just echo. They pierced the calm of the park like an unwelcome alarm, sending ripples of unease through the onlookers. Some of them shuffled nervously, their eyes darting between the confrontation and their phones, unsure whether to intervene, record, or simply disappear before things escalated. The woman, still seated on the bench, seemed frozen for a moment. Her hands gripped her knitting needles tightly, not out of fear, but as if they were an anchor in the storm. Her lips quivered slightly as she looked up at the man towering over her, trying to muster a response that wouldn't pour more gasoline onto the fire. "I'm just sitting here," she said quietly, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry a quiet dignity. "I didn't mean to bother anyone." The biker scoffed, his expression darkening as he leaned in closer. "You think this is about you bothering someone? People like you don't even realize when you're in the wrong place, do you?" His words dripped with disdain, and though he didn't touch her, the way he invaded her space made it clear he was trying to intimidate her. The small crowd grew more anxious. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something into their ear before hurriedly walking away. A young couple whispered to each other, one of them nervously pointing at the scene, but neither making a move to step in. It wasn't just fear that kept them at bay. It was uncertainty. No one wanted to misstep or make things worse. Yet in the midst of it all, there was one man who hadn't looked away. John Cena remained against the tree, his arms still crossed, but his stance had shifted slightly. Subtle changes, his shoulders squared, his posture more rigid, hinted that he was readying himself for something. He wasn't a man who sought out conflict, but he wasn't the type to stand by and let someone abuse their power either. Still, he didn't move right away. He was watching, calculating, giving the situation a moment to resolve itself without his intervention. But deep down, he knew that might not happen. As the biker continued his rant, Cena's mind raced through the possibilities. Who was this man? What was driving his anger? And why had he chosen this elderly woman as his target? Cena had seen plenty of bullies in his time, people who lashed out not because of who they were attacking, but because of something broken inside themselves. It didn't make their actions right, but it did make them predictable. This guy was no different. The woman, though visibly shaken, straightened her back and spoke again, this time with a touch more firmness. "I don't know what you think I've done wrong, but I've been coming to this park for years. This bench has always been my spot to sit and knit. I'm not hurting anyone." Her words, simple and true, should have been enough to diffuse the situation. But instead, they seemed to ignite the biker's temper further. He took a step back, shaking his head, as if her calmness was an insult to his authority. "Years, huh?" he muttered bitterly. "Maybe it's time for a change." He kicked at the edge of the bench, not hard enough to break anything, but enough to rattle it. The woman flinched, her knitting needle slipping from her grasp and clattering to the ground. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. And then finally, Cena moved. It wasn't dramatic or loud. He didn't yell or charge into the scene. Instead, he simply walked forward, his footsteps deliberate and calm, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The crowd noticed him immediately, their murmurs shifting from concern to curiosity. Some of them recognized him right away, their eyes widening in disbelief. Was it really him, here, now? The biker, too, noticed the movement and turned his head. His expression twisted into a mixture of confusion and annoyance as Cena closed the distance. He wasn't expecting anyone to interrupt him, let alone someone who carried themselves with such quiet authority. "Everything okay here?" Cena asked, his voice steady and low, but loud enough to cut through the tension like a knife. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't casual either. It was the kind of voice that made you stop and think twice before answering. The biker narrowed his eyes, sizing him up. He didn't recognize Cena, not yet, anyway, and assumed he was just another meddling bystander. "Mind your own business," he snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "This has nothing to do with you." Cena didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he took another step closer, positioning himself between the biker and the elderly woman. The air around him seemed to change, the weight of his presence enough to make even the most stubborn man hesitate. "It's everyone's business when someone's being treated unfairly," Cena said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that hinted at the strength beneath the surface. He glanced over his shoulder at the woman, offering her a reassuring nod before turning his full attention back to the biker. The crowd was silent now, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene. The tension hadn't lessened. It had merely shifted. The biker's bravado faltered for a moment, but he quickly covered it up with a sneer. "Oh, I see how it is," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Big guy wants to play hero." Cena tilted his head slightly, his expression remaining calm. "It's not about playing hero. It's about doing what's right." The biker let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head as he took a step back. But even as he tried to maintain his tough exterior, it was clear he was reevaluating the situation. There was something about Cena, something unshakable, that made it impossible to ignore him. For the first time, the biker's confidence seemed to waver. He glanced at the crowd, now fully aware that all eyes were on him, and then back at Cena, who stood firm, his gaze unwavering. The balance of power had shifted, and though the biker didn't want to admit it, he was no longer in control of the situation. Still, he wasn't ready to back down completely. Not yet. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do?" he challenged, his voice tinged with defiance. Cena didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step forward, closing the gap between them until they were nearly face to face. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but firm. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm asking you to think about what you're doing." The words hung in the air, simple but powerful. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the biker didn't have a quick comeback. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would the biker back down? Would Cena's calm demeanor be enough to diffuse the situation? Or was this just the calm before the storm? To be continued. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every second feel like an eternity. The crowd remained frozen, their collective breaths held in anticipation. The biker stood his ground, his jaw tightening as he looked Cena up and down. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps recognition, though he wasn't ready to admit it. He wasn't the type to back down, especially not in front of an audience. But something about Cena's calm, unyielding presence had started to chip away at his bravado. The elderly woman, still seated on the bench, watched the exchange with wide, uncertain eyes. She didn't know who the man defending her was, but there was something reassuring about the way he carried himself. For the first time since the biker had approached her, she felt a glimmer of safety. She bent down slowly, her hands trembling, and picked up her fallen knitting needles. It was a small act, but it gave her a sense of control in a situation that had spiraled far beyond her grasp. The biker finally broke the silence, his voice louder now, as if trying to regain control of the moment. "You don't know me, man. You don't know what I've been through. Don't act like you're better than me." Cena didn't flinch. He met the biker's gaze with steady resolve, his tone remaining measured. "You're right. I don't know you. But I know what I see, and right now I see someone who's hurting. Someone who's taking it out on the wrong person." The biker's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're some kind of therapist now. Don't try to psychoanalyze me." His words were sharp, but there was a crack in his voice, a faint tremor that hinted at something deeper beneath the surface. It was subtle, but Cena caught it. "This isn't about me," Cena said, his voice softer now but still firm. "And it's not about her either. It's about you. Whatever's going on in your life, whatever's making you act this way, this isn't the answer." The biker's shoulders tensed, and for a moment, it looked like he might lash out. But then he hesitated, his gaze darting to the crowd that had gathered around them. He could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment pressing down like a weight he couldn't shake. The anger in his expression faltered, replaced by something else, something more vulnerable. Before he could respond, a voice from the crowd cut through the silence. "Hey, isn't that John Cena?" The words were like a spark in dry grass. The murmurs spread quickly, whispers of recognition rippling through the onlookers. Some of them pulled out their phones, holding them up to capture the moment. The biker stiffened, his expression shifting to one of confusion and disbelief. He turned back to Cena, his eyes narrowing as he studied him more closely. "No way," the biker muttered under his breath. "You're not." He stopped himself, the realization dawning slowly but surely. "You're him, aren't you? The wrestler." Cena didn't confirm or deny it. He simply held the biker's gaze, his expression unchanged. He wasn't here to bask in fame or make a spectacle of the situation. He was here to stand up for what was right, and nothing more. The biker took a step back, the weight of the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just arguing with some random guy in the park. He was arguing with someone the world admired, someone who stood for strength, integrity, and respect. And suddenly, his actions felt a lot harder to justify. But the biker's pride was a stubborn thing, and he wasn't ready to let go of it entirely. "So what if you're John Cena?" he said, his tone defensive. "That doesn't mean you get to tell me how to live my life." Cena nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. "You're right. I don't. But you've got a choice right now. You can keep going down this path, or you can take a step back and think about what kind of person you want to be." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The biker opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced at the crowd again, his confidence eroding with every second that passed. For the first time, he looked uncertain, unsure of himself, unsure of what to do next. In the background, the elderly woman quietly gathered her things, her hands still trembling, but her movements deliberate. She glanced up at Cena, her eyes filled with gratitude, and gave him a small nod. She didn't want to be the center of attention any longer. She just wanted to go back to her quiet life, free from the chaos of the last few minutes. The biker noticed her movement and turned to her, his expression softening ever so slightly. He hesitated, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he turned back to Cena, his posture less confrontational now, though the tension in his shoulders hadn't fully eased. "Why do you even care?" the biker asked, his voice quieter, almost vulnerable. "What's it to you?" Cena took a step closer, his tone gentle but firm. "Because everyone deserves to be treated with respect. And sometimes we all need someone to remind us of that, even when we're at our worst." The biker stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out again, like the weight of his own emotions was too much to bear. But then he exhaled, his shoulders sagging as if a heavy burden had been lifted. The crowd watched in silence, their phones still held aloft, capturing every second. The story wasn't over, not yet. But something had shifted in the air, a subtle but undeniable change that hinted at the possibility of redemption. The silence stretched thick and heavy as the biker stood there, caught between his own pride and the truth that had just been laid bare. The weight of Cena's words hung in the air, pressing down on him in a way that felt almost unbearable. He glanced around again, his eyes darting to the faces in the crowd. Some were watching with quiet judgment, others with cautious curiosity, but no one looked away. It was as though the entire park had been pulled into this moment, their collective focus trapping him in a spotlight he hadn't asked for. His jaw tightened, and he let out a sharp breath, shaking his head as if trying to clear his thoughts. But the vulnerability that had flickered in his eyes earlier was still there, just below the surface. He wanted to walk away, to escape this situation and the suffocating feeling that came with it. But something, perhaps it was the unwavering calm in Cena's gaze, or the quiet dignity of the woman he'd confronted, kept him rooted in place. Cena didn't push him. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, steady and unyielding, his presence alone a reminder of the strength it took to choose the harder path. The tension between them was palpable, the kind that made every second feel like a tightly wound spring about to snap. The biker's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his breathing uneven. "You don't get it," he muttered, his voice low and strained. "You stand there like you've got it all figured out, like it's so easy to be the bigger person. But you don't know what it's like to feel like the whole world's against you." Cena tilted his head slightly, his expression softening but still resolute. "I don't know your story," he admitted. "But I know what it's like to struggle, to feel like you've got to fight for everything. I've been there, and I know that taking it out on someone else doesn't make it better. It just makes you feel more alone." The biker flinched, the words hitting him harder than he'd expected. He looked away, his gaze dropping to the ground, as if he couldn't bear to meet Cena's eyes any longer. The crowd shifted uneasily, their murmurs barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. They were waiting for something to happen, for the tension to break. And then, as if on cue, a voice called out from the back of the crowd. "Hey, is everything okay here?" The question cut through the stillness, drawing all eyes to a man in a park ranger uniform making his way toward them. His presence added another layer of unease to the scene, the subtle authority in his posture a reminder that things could escalate in an entirely different direction if they weren't careful. The ranger stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the group before settling on Cena and the biker. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Cena took a step back, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of non-aggression. "Just a misunderstanding," he said evenly. "We're sorting it out." The ranger's eyes lingered on the biker, who was still standing stiffly, his fists clenched at his sides. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough authority to make it clear he wasn't asking for the sake of conversation. For a moment, the biker didn't respond. He was still staring at the ground, his jaw working as if he were trying to chew through the knot of emotions tangled inside him. Finally, he looked up, his gaze flicking between Cena, the elderly woman, and the ranger. His face was a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, shame, defiance. But there was something else there too, something quieter and harder to define. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice rough. "We're sorting it out." The ranger studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good," he said simply. "Let's keep it that way." He didn't move right away, though. He stayed where he was, his presence a quiet but unmistakable reminder that he was still watching, ready to step in if necessary. The crowd seemed to take this as their cue to start dispersing, their whispers fading into the background as they drifted back to their own lives. A few lingered, their phones still in hand, but the tension in the air had shifted, the sharp edge of confrontation dulled to something more uncertain. The elderly woman had gathered her things by now, her knitting neatly tucked into a small bag that she clutched tightly in her lap. She glanced at Cena, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and unease. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stepped in." Cena turned to her, his expression gentle. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "No one should have to go through that." The woman nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line as she looked at the biker. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something to him, but she hesitated. The words caught somewhere between her heart and her tongue. Instead, she stood up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, and began to make her way toward the park's exit. The biker watched her go, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything, but the way his shoulders sagged suggested that her quiet departure had hit him harder than any words ever could. Cena turned back to him, his gaze steady. "It's not too late," he said quietly. "You can still make things right." The biker didn't respond, his eyes fixed on a spot in the distance where the woman had disappeared. The ranger lingered for another moment before nodding to Cena and walking away, leaving the two men alone in the now empty circle of pavement. The tension wasn't gone, not entirely. But something had shifted, a crack forming in the wall of anger and pride that the biker had built around himself. The question now was whether that crack would be enough to let the light in. The biker stood there in silence, his fists loosening at his sides, but his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He couldn't shake the image of the elderly woman walking away, her quiet dignity more cutting than any harsh words could have been. Cena's words lingered too, like an itch he couldn't scratch. They had stirred something inside him, something he wasn't ready to confront. For a moment, he considered leaving, just walking away and burying the whole incident in the back of his mind. But he couldn't. Not yet. As Cena watched him, he noticed a subtle shift in the man's demeanor, an almost imperceptible falter in his tough exterior. Before either of them could speak, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the uneasy silence. A young woman emerged from the edge of the crowd that had just begun to disperse. She looked to be in her late 20s, her face flushed as though she'd been running. Her eyes darted between Cena and the biker, widening when they landed on the latter. "Jason," she said, her voice sharp with both surprise and concern. "What are you doing here?" The biker, Jason, froze, his expression hardening. "Mindy, what are you doing here?" He shot back, his tone defensive. Mindy ignored his question, her gaze shifting to Cena with a mixture of confusion and recognition. "Wait, are you?" She didn't finish the question, but the realization in her eyes was obvious. She blinked, shaking her head as if to refocus, before turning back to Jason. "What's going on? Why are all these people filming you?" Jason's jaw clenched, his posture stiffening as he glanced around at the lingering bystanders. "Nothing," he muttered, his tone clipped. "It's none of your business." "It doesn't look like nothing," Mindy said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Jason, what happened?" Jason glared at her, but there was a flicker of guilt in his eyes, a crack in his bravado. "I was just—" He stopped, his words faltering. "I didn't mean for it to turn into this." Mindy's expression softened, but there was a hint of exasperation in her voice. "What did you do?" Jason didn't answer, his gaze dropping to the ground. Mindy turned to Cena, her eyebrows raised in a silent question. Cena hesitated, unsure how much to say. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but the truth was already out in the open. "There was a misunderstanding," Cena said carefully. "It's being worked out." Mindy frowned, her eyes narrowing as she pieced together the unspoken details. "Jason," she said softly, her voice tinged with both disappointment and concern. "You promised me you were going to try. You said you were done letting your anger control you." Jason flinched, the words hitting him like a physical blow. He didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Mindy sighed, running a hand through her hair as she glanced at Cena again. "I'm sorry about whatever happened," she said, her tone sincere. "He's not a bad person. He's just going through a lot." Jason's head snapped up at that, his expression a mix of anger and embarrassment. Don't talk about me like I'm not here, he snapped. And don't make excuses for me. I'm not making excuses, Mindy said, her voice steady. I'm just trying to help. I don't need your help, Jason shot back, his voice rising. I don't need anyone's help. The tension between them crackled like static electricity, drawing the attention of the remaining bystanders. Cena stepped forward, his calm presence cutting through the charged atmosphere. Maybe you don't, he said, his tone measured. But it doesn't hurt to have it. Jason looked at him, his eyes narrowing. You don't get it, he said, his voice raw. You stand there like some hero, like you've got it all figured out. But you don't know what it's like to feel like everything's falling apart. Mindy opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a sudden shout from the other side of the park drew everyone's attention. A group of teenagers had gathered near the edge of the playground, their voices raised in alarm. One of them was pointing toward the pond, where a small dog was struggling in the water, its frantic movements barely keeping it afloat. Without hesitation, Cena took off toward the pond, his long strides eating up the distance in seconds. The crowd that had been lingering near the confrontation turned to follow, their phones still recording as the drama shifted to a new stage. Jason hesitated, torn between his instinct to walk away and the growing sense of unease in his chest. He glanced at Mindy, who was already moving toward the commotion, before reluctantly following. By the time Jason and Mindy reached the edge of the pond, Cena was already in the water, his powerful strokes cutting through the murky surface as he made his way toward the struggling dog. The crowd watched in tense silence, their earlier curiosity replaced by genuine concern. Jason found himself holding his breath as Cena reached the dog, scooping the small, trembling creature into his arms before swimming back to shore. When Cena emerged from the water, soaked but triumphant, the crowd erupted into cheers. He set the dog down gently on the grass, where it immediately shook itself off before wagging its tail in gratitude. The teenagers who had sounded the alarm rushed forward, their relief evident as they knelt to check on the dog. Jason watched the scene unfold, his emotions a swirling mix of admiration and self-recrimination. He glanced at Mindy, who was watching Cena with wide eyes, her expression a mixture of awe and something else. Something Jason couldn't quite name, but knew he didn't deserve. As Cena straightened, the dog safe and the crisis averted, he looked up and locked eyes with Jason. There was no judgment in his gaze, no condemnation. Just the same steady resolve and quiet strength that had been there from the beginning. And for the first time, Jason felt the weight of his own choices in a way he never had before. The stakes had shifted again, the conflict deepened by this unexpected turn. Jason didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep running from himself. Not anymore. As the cheers and applause from the crowd slowly faded, the tension between Jason and his own inner turmoil reached its breaking point. He stood frozen, watching Cena interact with the teenagers as they thanked him profusely. The little dog, now safe and no longer trembling, wagged its tail as if unaware of the life or death struggle it had just survived. Jason couldn't look away, the scene pulling at something deep inside him. Mindy touched his arm gently, her voice soft but firm. Jason, don't let this moment pass you by. Say something. Do something. Jason's throat tightened, 1,000 emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to turn around and leave, to bury himself in the familiar comfort of his anger and pride. But he couldn't. Not this time. Not with so many eyes on him. And not with the realization that Cena had shown him a version of strength he'd never considered before, one rooted in kindness and humility. Taking a deep breath, Jason took a step forward. The crowd parted slightly, their eyes shifting to him as he approached Cena, who was wringing out the bottom of his soaked shirt. Cena noticed him coming and straightened, his expression calm but watchful. "Hey," Jason said, his voice rough. He glanced down, shoving his hands into his pockets, before forcing himself to meet Cena's gaze. I owe you an apology. For everything." The admission hung in the air, the weight of it heavier than Jason had anticipated. He shifted uncomfortably under the collective gaze of the crowd, but he didn't look away. He couldn't. Cena nodded, his expression softening. "It takes guts to say that," he said simply. "More than most people realize." Jason swallowed hard, his gaze flicking to Mindy, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and cautious optimism. "I don't know how to fix everything I've messed up," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to try. I don't want to be this guy anymore." "You don't have to be," Cena said, his tone steady. "It's never too late to change." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jason felt a glimmer of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the first step. As the tension in the air began to dissipate, the crowd started to disperse, their curiosity satisfied and their phones slipping back into pockets and bags. Mindy stepped closer to Jason, her expression softening as she placed a hand on his arm. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. Jason managed a small, awkward smile. "Thanks," he said, his voice still thick with emotion. I'm sorry for how I've been. To you. To everyone." Mindy nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's a start." Before Jason could respond, a commotion near the edge of the park drew everyone's attention. A man in a dark hoodie was running toward the parking lot, clutching something tightly to his chest. A woman's panicked voice called out, "Stop him. He has my purse." Without hesitation, Cena sprang into action, sprinting after the man with a speed that seemed almost superhuman. Jason watched in stunned silence for a moment before his own instincts kicked in. He bolted after Cena, his long strides closing the gap between him and the fleeing man. The crowd watched in breathless anticipation as Cena and Jason pursued the thief. Cena's steady determination was matched by Jason's newfound resolve, the two of them moving in sync as they closed in on their target. The thief, realizing he was outmatched, veered toward a narrow alley in a desperate attempt to escape. Cena was the first to reach him, grabbing the man's arm and pulling him to a stop. Jason arrived moments later, his breath coming in heavy gasps as he helped Cena restrain the struggling thief. Together, they managed to retrieve the stolen purse before the man broke free and fled into the shadows. Jason held the purse for a moment, staring down at it as his chest heaved. The adrenaline coursing through his veins was unlike anything he'd ever felt. Not the wild, chaotic rush of a fight, but something cleaner, more purposeful. He handed the purse to Cena, who gave him a nod of approval. "Nice work," Cena said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Looks like you've got some hero in you after all." Jason let out a shaky laugh, the tension in his body beginning to ease. "I wouldn't go that far," he said, but there was a hint of pride in his voice. For the first time, he felt like he'd done something that mattered, something that wasn't about proving himself, but about doing the right thing. They returned to the park, where the grateful woman thanked them profusely as she took back her purse. The crowd, now smaller but just as engaged, erupted into cheers and applause. Jason couldn't help but feel a flush of embarrassment at the attention, but it was different this time. It wasn't about judgment or ridicule, it was about respect. As the evening sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the park in a warm golden glow, Jason found himself standing next to Cena once more. He glanced at the man who had, in just a few hours, completely upended his view of what it meant to be strong. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "For everything." Cena smiled, his expression one of quiet understanding. "Just keep going," he said, "one step at a time." Jason nodded, the words sinking in. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. As he walked away with Mindy by his side, he couldn't help but glance back at Cena one last time. The man who had changed everything with nothing more than his presence, his words, and his actions. But just as he turned back toward the path ahead, a thought struck him, a quiet, unsettling realization. The thief, the one they'd stopped, had dropped something as he fled. Something Jason had barely noticed in the chaos. A folded piece of paper with a name scrawled across it. And that name was Jason's. Jason stood frozen, staring at the folded piece of paper in his hand. His name, scrawled in jagged handwriting, sent a chill down his spine. Mindy noticed his sudden stillness and stepped closer, concern etched on her face. "Jason, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice low enough not to draw attention from the crowd still lingering in the park. He handed her the paper, his hand trembling slightly. Mindy unfolded it carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. The words inside were cryptic, but clear enough to set her heart racing. Asterisk, you can't run from who you are. Asterisk. Jason felt his pulse quicken. The phrase echoed in his mind, stirring memories he had buried long ago. He glanced toward the alley where the thief had escaped, a strange sense of unease settling over him. Who was that guy? And why did he have a message for Jason? Mindy looked up at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and worry. "What does this mean?" she asked. "I don't know," Jason admitted, his voice hoarse. "But it's not a coincidence." Before either of them could say more, Cena approached, his calm presence grounding them both. He noticed the paper in Mindy's hand and the unsettled look on Jason's face. "Something wrong?" he asked. Jason hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing," he said, folding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. He wasn't ready to unpack this in front of Cena, or anyone else. Not yet. Cena studied him for a moment, his piercing gaze seeming to see more than Jason was willing to share. But he didn't press. Instead, he nodded and said, "Sometimes it takes time to figure things out. Don't rush it." Jason felt a pang of gratitude for the man's understanding. He nodded back, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Thanks," he said quietly. The evening wore on, and the crowd eventually dispersed. The park grew quieter, the earlier chaos replaced by a sense of calm. Mindy stayed by Jason's side, her presence a steady anchor as they walked toward the parking lot. The weight of the day's events hung heavy between them, but neither spoke for a while. The silence was comfortable, though giving Jason space to process everything. Finally, Mindy broke the silence. "You've changed," she said softly, her eyes on the path ahead. Jason glanced at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You're different," she said, meeting his gaze. "I don't know if it's because of today, or if it's been building for a while, but you're not the same guy who used to snap at everyone and push people away." Jason let her words sink in, his mind flashing back to the moment he'd confronted the elderly woman, the shame and regret he'd felt when he saw the hurt in her eyes. He thought about the way Cena had stepped in, not with anger or aggression, but with calm, unwavering strength. And he thought about the choice he'd made to follow Cena after the thief, to help instead of hurt. "Maybe I'm finally starting to figure out who I want to be," he said after a moment. "Or who I don't want to be." Mindy smiled, a small but genuine expression that warmed something in Jason's chest. That's a good place to start. They reached the parking lot, and Jason paused, looking out at the fading light. The day had been a whirlwind, a series of moments that had pushed him to confront parts of himself he'd long ignored. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't even sure he had most of them. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. As he and Mindy said their goodbyes and went their separate ways, Jason couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease about the note. He pulled it out of his pocket one more time, staring at the words. Asterisk, you can't run from who you are. Asterisk. It felt like a challenge, a reminder of the man he used to be, or maybe a warning about the man he could still become if he wasn't careful. But instead of fear, he felt a spark of determination. Whoever had left that message didn't know him. Not the real him. Not the person he was trying to become. In the days that followed, Jason threw himself into rebuilding his life. He reached out to the elderly woman he'd confronted in the park, offering a heartfelt apology that brought tears to her eyes. He volunteered at a local community center, finding purpose in helping others. And he worked on repairing his relationship with Mindy, showing her through his actions that he was committed to being better.